Welcome to Manager Tools. The purpose of feedback, part 2. This cast answers these questions. What is the purpose of feedback? Why should I give more feedback? Why is negative feedback so flippin' hard? Well, if you want answers to these questions and more, keep listening. Here we go.
Necessity is the mother of invention, and 5 years ago, Manager Tools needed to find a way to bring our guidance to you remotely. Fortunately, we were able to create virtual modules of our training to allow us to work with your teams while they were, at that time, most likely, working from home. 5 years later, we have the value of a delivery mechanism from which organizations with geographically dispersed teams can still benefit. If you've got a team that's spread out, making it difficult to pull them together for a training event, contact Maggie to learn more and review the modules for our Virtual Effective Manager, Effective Communicator, and Effective Hiring Manager trainings. We'll take care of all of the admin, scheduling, and calendaring. Just send a note to customer service at manager-tools.com to learn more.
Last week, we spent time talking about the purpose of feedback, and the first part of it was encourage. So, folks, if you haven't listened to that, go back and listen, because that's important. If you don't get
it's the first word. It's the verb.
It's a verb and the first word. So today we're going to talk about effective, because of course you can be encouraging, but if feedback doesn't work, you're kind of missing out on your responsibilities as a manager. You're really trying to encourage future effective performance. So let's talk about effective.
Yeah. So again, there's 4 parts: encourage, effective, future, behavior. Those are the 4 parts. We did encourage. So now we're going to dig into effectiveness, which should be the motto, the unofficial motto of all managers.
Yeah, it's something to do with our mission. I think we have something about making managers effective.
Every manager effective. Yeah. And this is another reason, just like encourage, that there's only one feedback model. And the vast majority of purveyors of feedback make the mistake of only talking about negative. They don't say negative. In fact, they say feedback and then only give negative examples. And they have created a situation in the vast majority of managers all over the world that feedback by definition is negative. But it doesn't have to be.
That's right. It's like your steering wheel only giving you feedback to your hands when you're going in the wrong direction. Not when you're going in the right direction, but when you're going in the wrong direction. Yeah,
exactly. Because whether you're giving positive or negative feedback, your purpose is to focus on effectiveness. Okay. Behaviors that get the right work done as efficiently as possible. We can't think of many better ways to think about our work as managers rather than focusing on effectiveness. It's not about personality. It's not about making people feel better, although certainly with a trusting relationship, you can give both positive and negative feedback in ways that make people feel better. I'm reminded of the old saw relative to negative feedback is your goal is to step on somebody's shoes, but still leave a shine. In other words, can you separate the person from their behavior? Well, people aren't inherently effective or ineffective. They're not. So therefore, we don't talk about the person. Now, there are some people who will say, well, Mark, I identify with my work. Well, my answer to that is that's good. I'm okay with that. It's not really true. But if you feel that way, wouldn't you want your work to be effective? And by that, I mean in support of the organization's goals. Not what you want, not what you like, not what you're good at, but rather that which gets us toward our goals, which ultimately roll up to the organization achieving its goals, which certainly helps with retention and probably definitely helps with results as well. In fact, to be effective as a manager, your first rule is to achieve results, whatever those may be, to achieve the goals you're given. And then also, of course, retention, keeping your people. Make your directs more effective, and they'll not only prosper, obviously, you will too. Imagine a manager who is well-liked, even loved by his or her directs, that doesn't achieve their goals. nobody else seems to say this very often, but if you're loved as a manager and you don't achieve your goals, at some point your boss has an obligation to say to you, you yourself are not being effective, even if you feel love and respect and kindness and good, solid human relations with your people. Now, we're not suggesting that you should avoid the people side of things. We want people to feel good about their work, but as we've said many times, your job is not to be a psychologist, not to try to make people feel happy, but rather to help them achieve. And as adults, they'll learn that their own happiness is their business, and they'll learn to become happy when they're effective. But effectiveness being part of the purpose of feedback makes it easier to give feedback for more than just that reason. Effectiveness, as a general principle, allows us to avoid having a discussion about the mistakes that were made. I think we have an upcoming Things We Think coming out where there's a quote in there by David Weber, and he says, human beings always make two things, tools and mistakes. And so as a manager, your people are going to make mistakes just like you do, and you're going to have to steer them in the right direction. But that doesn't mean focusing on the mistake. Examining a mistake, thinking that your job is to think about the mistake rather than about effectiveness generally, you end up talking about mistakes more often, and no direct likes talking about their mistakes. And frankly, most bosses, particularly those that don't understand the principles of feedback, which we're getting into here, obviously, most managers don't like talking about mistakes either. Well, the purpose of feedback, both positive and negative, is not to talk about mistakes. It's talk about effectiveness.
Yeah, but it makes me a much better person if the person who's giving me feedback about a negative thing, I'm just thinking maybe my wife, maybe, but if she were to talk and talk and talk and share about that mistake for a half an hour, it's not going to work well. Doesn't work well with directs either.
Are you sure you want this recorded on both audio and video, Mr. Ozan? I know your wife.
Yeah, she's really retired,
well.
so she's not watching this stuff now.
Okay, fair enough.
Again, she had too much. She had too much of me.
Well,
That's not a
I
good
mentioned
thing.
earlier about how management guidance today essentially has reduced feedback to only being negative feedback. And that's just wrong. It certainly doesn't. If all you do is talk to your directs about their mistakes, they're not going to feel encouraged. And we already talked about encouragement last week. In fact, examining mistakes has led to terrible popular management guidance. Now, of course, if you've listened to Manager Tools for a while, you know that when we say popular management guidance, what we mean is bad management guidance. Everybody's looking for the right theme, the right fad, the right thing this HR consulting firm or management consulting firm can teach, can sell to large organizations. But the latest example of this is the idea of having a dialogue with your direct about why they did what they did and what they were thinking. Again, they're talking about feedback, but they're only talking about the negative part of it. I don't see any guidance that says, when your folks too good, I want you to dig into that. I want you to try to learn why they did what they did, swim upstream into their mind, stupid, and figuring out why they did what they did so you can encourage them to do it again. It's much easier to just focus on if they did something good, tell them that was good, and I'd like more of the same in the future to reinforce the behavior rather than, again, trying to get into the why and the what and the how and so on, which is generally, first of all, it takes a lot longer and it's generally not effective. How do we know that? Because this is Manager Tools and we've tested it. We've tested longer versions of shortened positive and negative feedback, and the shorter the model is, the better. And so you don't have time to give dialogue to your directs.
Right. That's the problem with longer feedback, which is in the mind of the manager becomes a long, drawn out thing. Oh my God, I have to give them feedback. It's going to be 10 minutes. I'm not going to do it. I don't have time. Right. And if it's 10 seconds, everybody has 10 seconds.
Right. We ask at all of our effective management conferences, and folks, if you don't know this, Manager Tools hosts hundreds of management conferences, largely in the US, but all over the world as well. And we ask these groups every single time, If you had a choice, you didn't know whether your boss was going to give you positive or negative feedback, and she gave you a choice between 15 seconds or 2 minutes, you would choose 15 seconds every time. When we ask groups, they're all like, yep, I definitely want 15 seconds. I don't want a deep dive into why I did something wrong. And I really don't need a deep dive into why I did something right. I just need to know that my boss thinks that it was effective, that it was in line with the goals, in alignment with his or her goals are and the organization's goals, which she's responsible for giving me goals if she's my boss that fit within the larger goals of the organization.
To me, if someone gave me long feedback, I think it's disrespectful, as if I'm not an adult, as if I'm not able to figure out how to correct the mistake I made.
Right.
It's great. It's great to know that whatever I did didn't work, but I can figure out, or I can come back to you and ask you later. But to try to dig into my mind and make me walk through this torturous path I went through in my head to figure out what I did.
Yeah.
Like, no, don't do that to me.
Yeah. Now, there's an aside here where some people in the technical world have this idea that they're supposed to dig into it and do, for every single mistake, they're supposed to do a root cause analysis. Now, look, folks, we've talked about this before. We love root cause analysis for technical problems where we really need to go back and understand what actually happened, where we made the mistake in our planning and our delivery, where we misunderstood what the customer wanted, internal or external customer, it doesn't matter. But unfortunately, when you start spending time trying to understand in a root cause analysis can take an hour or two. If every single time one of your directs makes a mistake, focusing on the negative here for a second, you're going to end up spending all your time doing root cause analysis. And to your point, most people don't need that. One of the things we haven't said in this cast, although we've said it 100, if not 1,000 times in our other casts about feedback, is that when you take that long, people get distanced from it, and it makes it so that they end up talking about their mistake. In fact, just for the record, we're not going to go into a great deal of detail. We have an entire podcast called Feedback Dialogue is Stupid Guidance. It really is. It may be popular, but that just makes it stupid. When you talk to your direct about their mistake, they're going to be defensive. If they believe that the purpose of the conversation is to talk about the mistake, and that's not the purpose of feedback, it doesn't say correct ineffective behavior. It says encourage effective behavior. So when you start talking about their mistake, they're going to be defensive. You have role power. That's bad enough. But they're also going to revisit why they did what they did. And they're adults. They're reasonably intelligent people, assuming your hiring processes are good, and many of them are. They're going to then revisit why they did what they did, and it made sense for them at the time that they did it. Them reviewing why they did what they did during the conversation reinforces why they did the thing that didn't turn out as well or wasn't effective. And that's not good either.
Well, there's another thing people need to understand. If you're a manager and someday you aspire to be an executive, you're CEO, believe it or not, there are things happening in your company that you don't understand at a detailed level. You don't, right?
Right.
So the idea that I have to have a dialogue and walk through somebody's reason why they did something then suggests that if somebody does something, we have poor results, and I don't know how to actually do that result, accomplish that result, then I'm not able to give feedback, which is just on the surface of it ridiculous, right?
Right. It doesn't work at scale in large, even medium, even small organizations. Now, the purpose of feedback is about effectiveness. That's one of the 4 parts. When we give positive feedback, we encourage the same effective behavior in the future. And we'll talk about future here in just a minute. When we give negative feedback, and the same tone is positive, as we mentioned, because there's only one model, a feedback model, and it works for both positive and negative. By the way, that's great for managers because they don't have to learn two. All we do is focus on asking them to do better next time. One of the things that we teach feedback quite frequently is feedback should be about small things. One of the problems managers have with feedback is they wait and they wait and they wait until there's this pattern of behavior, all the while the direct continuing to make mistakes when we're talking about negative feedback. And then they bring the direct into their office, close the door, and have a conversation about an issue that has come up. And when the direct hears they've made the same mistake or something in the same theme several times, they're like, well, why didn't you talk to me sooner?
Yeah.
Well, the manager says, in a way, sounding very much like a lawyer, I wanted a lot of evidence before I came and talked to you.
Oh, God.
The problem with that is when you bring up 5, 6, 7 things, it becomes a big thing. The smaller things, each one of those things would have been a small thing you could have talked about, and it wouldn't have been that big a deal, and it wouldn't have been that hard for the direct to focus on, I'll try to be more effective next time. When you have a conversation about an issue, it becomes a big thing. The kind of thing that directs worry about is going to be in their performance review at the end of the year. But really effective feedback is about shorter, smaller, simpler. I can't remember who coined this for me. I may have, but I know a bunch of people have written in, and one person, I think it was Matt Bentliff, said really well, sooner and shorter, not longer and later. You don't want your boss to wait. Imagine you find out your boss is waiting. She's seen a couple of things, but she's not saying anything to you. Do you prefer that? Most people would say, no, I prefer my boss talk to me right away when there's something that I'm doing that's ineffective. I did something that I thought made sense. It didn't. Why would you want me to repeat it unless you were going to use that against me at some point in a conversation about an issue? So that's all we do. The focus is on effectiveness, whether it's positive or negative. In the case of positive, it's the same or similar. In the case of negative, it's simply asking for something different in the future. In fact, when you think about that for a minute as the recipient of that, you think, wow, my boss trusts me. He or she understands that I made a mistake. We all make mistakes. We make tools and we make mistakes. And I made a mistake, and he or she is not making that big a deal about it because they're focused on effectiveness and, as we say, in the future. One more thing about the effectiveness part of the purpose of feedback. Feedback being about effectiveness makes it about the organization and not the individual. I said that earlier. We don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't attack the person. Effectiveness isn't measured by how much we like something or how much we want to do it or how good or bad we are at it. It's not measured by what our preferences are. It's not even measured by what our skills are. There are some feedback models, of course, always negative because that's what managers are afraid of. But the purveyors of this guidance don't understand how badly they're hurting the concept of feedback being given when they only focus on negative. Giving negative feedback says nothing about the skills of the direct. It simply describes a gap between what they did and what the goals and objectives are. Positive feedback doesn't imply impressive skills or a genius brain. Negative feedback doesn't say you're weak or you're ineffective as a person. It just means in this particular situation, this was good, it was useful, effective, or it wasn't. Both positive and negative feedback simply say, here's where you are relative to what the organization needs from you. It's not about me. It's not about me attacking you. It's just a measurement of how you're doing against the goals we agreed to. Now, that's not to say that every manager in the world has been 100% clear with his or her directs. There's a lot about what they're supposed to be doing. There's a lot of lack of goal orientation because too many executives and then too many managers are not constantly talking to their directs about where they are and where they're supposed to be going and publicizing the goals and saying, let's measure against where we are and so on. About the closest thing we have to that is projects where there are actually deadlines on deliverables and we have project meetings and we measure things as red, amber, or green.
Yeah, look at that. Regular communications about achieving.
Yeah.
Wow.
In fact, a lot of project management's principles ought to be applied to day-to-day work where we can say, hey, this was off track and we need to get that back on track. What can you do about that? And trust your direct to give it another try. Now, look, if they continue to not get it, there are other things you can do. We have a podcast that's in our Hall of Fame called Systemic Feedback. You'll almost never use it, believe it or not. You're rarely going to get into a situation where you have to have a big conversation with somebody. And if nothing else, you ought to give them the credit for many, many chances to correct their own behavior rather than you stepping in and saying, hey, I really need you to do something differently. Feedback is not a construct of what's popular or what's new or what's interesting. Feedback is a verbal measure of a direct's contribution or lack of contribution to the mission and goals of the organization. There's no judgment of others in feedback. Now, some of your directs, particularly those that are less experienced, might feel judged, and you might want to say to them, this is not me judging you. Judging is better left to the courts and to higher powers, right? Measuring, yes, but not judging, okay? Managers and professionals don't judge. We plan and we measure. Feedback is simply the organization's way, and it's through the manager. The manager has the active responsibility to deliver it. It's the organization's way to help a direct see where they are relative to the work we're being asked to do. It's as simple as that. And when you see it as a quest for effectiveness, rather than seeking mistakes or praising the good things, by the way, praise makes people feel good, but it doesn't necessarily automatically make them better. You certainly need positive feedback, but sometimes managers just say, oh, I'm going to praise them, pat them on the back, kind of generically, big picture, not specifically say what they did so they know what to do next time. And then they use negative feedback for when they make mistakes. Well, that creates a two-tiered system for when my boss is praising me versus when he's giving me feedback, which is only negative. And again, that's just wrong. It's not just wrong. I would argue there's a bit of an ethical and a moral case there relative to your relationship with your people, but it's also just plain ineffective for the organization.
Yeah.
Conference is coming to Los Angeles in 2025. This October, our Conference will be in LA, and we're really excited to have it in California. See some people on that coast. If you're there, we'd love to have you. Conference is our executive level event for current or future executives. So come to the Conference, learn from others who achieved how they got there and what it takes to be great. Sign up at manager-tools.com/training.
Okay, our next piece kind of gets around the idea of feedback being punishment, right? Punishment is all about the past. Make somebody feel bad about what they did in the past, and somehow that's going to lead to better behavior.
In my opinion, Mike, as I've studied this in the last 30, 35 years, that may be one of the single biggest mistakes that managers make. They think, okay, my job is to look for mistakes. Folks, that's not your job, okay? And mistakes are going to happen, but rather you're supposed to encourage people to be effective, in this case, obviously, in the future. But if you punish someone, you're essentially saying, if I can instill fear for their mistake in the past, that will transmogrify into a positivity about the right thing in the future.
Yeah.
But there's ample evidence in psychology about punishment. I mean, gosh, one of my favorite stories is the one of the 4 monkeys, and they're put in a cage and they get sprayed with water. I'm not going to go into it in detail here. And at some point, if all you do is punish people for doing what seems reasonable to them, pretty soon they will tell everybody else, don't do anything because you're going to get punished if you get it wrong.
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but if you read the Wall Street Journal, if you read Harvard Business Review, you'll discover that innovation is a huge thing in the success of organizations.
Well, let's tell people they need to innovate, and then let's punish them every time.
Yeah,
they
let's
do something
punish them
wrong.
if they get it wrong, right? You're not going to get innovation in a culture of punishment. And too many managers think fear because they think of role power first rather than trust-based relationships, which come from one-on-ones. They think that that's the solution, but it doesn't work that way. And it certainly doesn't help with retention.
Yeah. And that's why encouragement, things we've already talked about, but also the vision of it's all about the future. It's really easy to get excited about a great future as opposed to punishing a past
Exactly.
bad thing.
So
right?
again, we'll say it again with different emphasis this time. The purpose of feedback is to encourage effective future behavior. This concept alone has brought hundreds of thousands of managers. Most of them are listeners because we're the only ones talking about it this way. That idea has brought them around to the principles and the delivery of feedback. The purpose of feedback is not to review or discuss or debate or argue about what our direct has already done. Yes, the direct's behavior is the genesis of the feedback conversation, but it is not its purpose. And that's a critical distinction that most managers don't get. They think that what we should be doing is talking about what the direct did. Because they don't understand it, they think their job is to examine or critique or judge or discuss or review what their direct did. They think their job with feedback is to teach. Sometimes that's built into the root cause analysis thing as well. And don't get us wrong, guys. Root cause analysis has its place. It's a powerful tool when done right, but it is simply not part of the modern effective manager's toolkit relative to day-to-day behavior against organizational goals. The job of a manager is not primarily to teach. Yes, there will be some teaching. It's not to teach or instruct or correct or judge or any other thing your own teachers did. And by the way, for the young people in your organization, their most recent role models were teachers. Your job is to encourage and measure and point out when people are doing the things that are getting us toward the measures we agreed to. That's effective behavior. And also to point out when something that they did measured incorrectly or ineffectively against the goals of the organization.
Yeah. It's too bad many managers feel really powerful when they correct or judge or they teach, right? They feel that's like, oh, wow, I shared my wisdom.
Yes, exactly. Their feeling of power about that makes them want to do it even more, even though it is exactly the opposite of the purpose of feedback. And it's not just against the purpose. It's counterproductive. Directs hate it. Now, there are times when a direct will come to you and say, hey, can you help me with this? I don't understand it. Sure, I'll be happy to help you with that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. There are going to be times when you teach, but it does not happen generally when you give feedback. Now, why is focusing on the past not the purpose of feedback? This is easy because there's nothing you can do about the past. The only sane reason, the only intelligent reason to have what amounts to a miniature performance conversation, and again, our feedback model takes you 10 or 15 seconds, sometimes as few as 5 when you get good at it. Going back to our comments about what would you rather have, 2 minutes with your boss or 15 seconds? The only sane reason to have a performance conversation with a direct after they've already done something, whether it's effective or not, is to either change their behavior in the future, that's what you're asking for with negative feedback, or to do more of the same again in the future. The only period of time we can influence, if somebody did something at 10 o'clock in the morning and now it's noon, you're not going to change the 10 o'clock in the morning experience. It happened. It's done. You can do nothing about it. Asking people to revisit it, as we've already made clear, I hope, is not going to change what they did. It might make them feel a certain way, and you might hope that those feelings transmogrify into some super effectiveness. But for the vast majority of us, a combination of fear in the workplace, the role power of the boss, we've tested it. It doesn't work. You might be able to do that if you're teaching a beginner level class. Okay, fine. But the vast majority of professionals are not in a beginner level class. They're at work with you now, and they're performing day to day to day. The only period of time we can influence is the future. If we told you that you could talk to your directs about what they did and how it measures up against our agreed upon goals, but that it would have no effect on their future behavior, would you ever do it? And the answer is no, I wouldn't do it. Now, you might be saying, well, I've seen a lot of bosses that did it this way. Yes. And what do we know about the average boss? He or she is not very good, in part because they don't understand the underlying principles at the heart, at the root of effective feedback. The whole point of feedback, despite the back in its name, is to motivate effective behavior in the future. This is true whether you're giving positive or negative feedback, asking for more of the same, or negative feedback, asking for something different. It's no more complicated than that, guys. It really isn't. Once a manager understands this, the judgment, the correction, the arrogant teaching will stop. And not only will that improve performance, it'll also improve trust. which is the cornerstone of effective managers. And as I like to say, I've said it many times in many casts, one of my favorite business book titles. It's not a great book. It's a good book. It's not a great book, but it has a great title, and it's called The Speed of Trust. If you're my boss and I trust you and you trust me, you can give me simpler guidance, shorter guidance. And because I trust you and you trust me, I can make decisions on that, which makes me feel useful. Many bosses attempt to make the jobs of their directs such that they don't have to make any decisions. And that's really, really, really bad. It certainly doesn't make for an innovative workplace or a workplace that retains people. If you want to build trust, and believe me, you do, after you get your one-on-ones underway and they're working and you're starting to build that trust, the thing you don't want to do is punish people. The thing you don't want to do is spend a lot of time talking about the past, because that erodes trust.
No doubt. So we'll stop here and we'll continue this next time. Everyone take care.